Hello and welcome to the Friday Download, the podcast where we give you the download on politics and policy and the business of the council leading into the weekend. Let's get into it. I'm Jordan Small. This is the Friday Download. Hello and welcome again to the Friday Download, episode 3, the 6th of December. I'm Jordan Small, Executive Director of the NZ US Council. In this episode, we're going to look at the state of the global trading environment, focusing domestically on recently released Trade for All report by the Trade for All Advisory Board. So we'll look at the politics around that report and what it's trying to do and what it was trying to address. Then we'll look at is the WTO at risk of falling over in the appellate body deadline coming up on the 10th or 11th of December. So there's plenty there to discuss. We're going to focus in on those two issues. And really the question I want to come back to throughout the episode is, why should we care and what are the implications? So luckily I've got two guests today who will navigate us through all of that. Both are members of the council, both are trade practitioners, and both have been trade negotiators. So I have Esther Guy-Meakin, who is manager of the International Trade Policy Team at Beef and Lamb New Zealand. And I have Tracy Epps, who is a trade consultant in the trade practice of Chapman Tripp. So I'm really pleased to have you both here today. It must be incredibly, it's uncertain times, but must be kind of interesting and exciting for you both, right?
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. There's not a dull moment in trade at the moment.
Yeah. And so I can imagine, what does a week look like for you guys? Because I know you're in Brazil and the US and all over the place. So what does a week look like? What are you dealing with? Where are you kind of flitting to each day in terms of your brain space and the countries you're taking in and considering?
It's pretty wide ranging for us. As a sector, we export to 120 different markets around the world, and we have some pretty tricky issues going on. So Brexit occupies a lot of my time, but big trading countries like China, the US, those are important markets for us. So what's going on there is also important.
Yeah, and you, Tracy, I know you're extremely busy at the moment.
Well, I guess we do a combination of work for both government and private sector. And for the private sector, they're just getting on with business. And so from my perspective, I'm trying to keep on top of all these issues because these issues do matter to New Zealand business. It's important that people understand what's going on and that they take these broader events into account in their, decision-making, their assessment of risk. But, at the end of the day, we're still helping clients with contracts and just getting on with business.
I think, why don't we get into the first segment? I'm actually quite excited about this show. I think it's really interesting issues. And I think we want to try and do it in a way that, it's quite accessible for people outside of the trade policy world. So let me play the first clip. Here it is.
Well, I believe that New Zealand has a right to govern itself, first and foremost. I believe that we're the ones who can make the decisions about our own land the best, and I disagree with the idea of a corporate model being the model for an international world.
It's our whenua, it's our land, it's our kids, it's our people, it's our funding, it's our treaty, it's everything.
We've got the power! People power!
So that was the RNZ clip from February 2016 of protesters in Auckland's Central Business District protesting over the signing of the Trans-Pacific Partnership by 12 signatories that day. And it was probably around that period that trade and trade agreements and trade policy came to the front pages and, was on the public radar. And it's actually about that time that I started to notice in my family members' Facebook postings, sort of the anti-trade, anti-TPP, anti-globalization messaging. And so, and they're really asking, I guess, in those posts, what are the benefits to me of these trade agreements? And so that's the discussion I want to have in this segment. So when the new Labour government came into power in 2017, they established an advisory board, so the Trade for All Advisory Board, who have recently released a report which the government is now considering. So I thought, why don't we take a look at what the advisory board was all about and trying to achieve. But I guess the place I want to start is to get a sum up of what it was, in that clip. What was those protesters trying? What were they concerned about? What were their central concerns? So maybe Esther will.
Sure. Yeah, I think from what I could. From my perspective, the key concern was really around that public policy space. There was a concern from the public that these types of agreements can constrain future government interest in protecting certain policy space. And I think some of the key concerns around that was around environment, health, Māori as well. And that fed into a whole range of different concerns about what different asks were being made of New Zealand in those respects. But I think as well, at the time, there was also a discussion about, there's parts of New Zealand that perhaps aren't doing as well as other parts of New Zealand, and why is that inequality happening, and what role is trade playing in that?
Yeah. So, the Trade for All Advisory Board has, they released their report, I think it was last week. Does that report go some way towards addressing those sorts of concerns that Esther is talking about, Tracy?
I think that it does. Sorry, can you hear me now? No, I think the report does a fantastic job of really highlighting a lot of these concerns. And I guess just sort of building on what Esther said, in the old days, if we go back to the 1940s, trade agreements were largely about tariffs, and issues at the border, red tape at customs. You try to get your goods into another country and you find that they're sitting on the wharf for weeks. And I think people are okay with those kinds of issues. We want to be able to sell our goods overseas. But as time has gone on, trade agreements have really just started to cover more and more areas of the economy. They cover services and services, restrictions on foreign service suppliers entering our economy. It's not about tariffs at the border. Excuse me. It's about domestic regulation. And so when we start making commitments that actually impact on how we regulate our domestic economy, that really starts to be... Excuse me, I see a frog in my throat today. That it's really a different kind of issue that you're looking at, and I think the report does a good job of recognising that. And one of the things I quite like about the report is it talks about the importance of really anticipating what policy space a government might need in future. It's about recognising that the decisions we make today and the obligations we enter into, to some degree, that they're going to impact on governments 5-10 years down the track.
So what does that mean when you say anticipating future policy space? I mean, what's an example of?
I guess one example I could give you sort of goes back to work I did quite some time ago in my master's studies, where I was actually in Canada looking at the implications of trade agreements for a country's healthcare system. And, healthcare is an area where there's often a lot of experimentation. Governments, do reforms, they see how things are working. It's an inherently difficult area, so in future they might want to change their course. What happens if you let foreign providers in because you want to privatise, you think that's the way to go, and then you realise that's not working so well, and you want to revert back to a more, domestically... to less foreign participation? Is a trade agreement going to restrict you in doing that? And it's those kinds of things where today we don't know what the healthcare system is going to look like in 10 years. What will work well, what doesn't. So it's finding a way to think about the policy space that you may need further down the track. Which, to be fair, TPP, I think the negotiators put my cards on the table, I was one of them. Every effort has been made to do that. But I think what the report is saying, that we need to go further and it needs to be more systematic.
Yeah. And what does the report suggest in terms, what kind of mechanisms do you put in place to do that? How do you identify those future policy spaces that you need to preserve? And
I think it's actually not just about the preservation piece of it. It's also about looking for opportunities. For instance, digital trade is an example where it's still, I guess, at the beginning of its journey. And so regulation and international rules around it are beginning to be a sexier topic. But, you don't have the same rules around digital trade that you do, for instance, in goods in my sector's interests. So it's also about anticipating what opportunities there are for the New Zealand economy. And I think that's an important part of the Trade for All agenda recommendation too, is looking at what the future holds. But I think in terms of how you do that, the Trade for All report talked about a more cohesive and collaborative approach among government departments. So a range of cross-agencies, work on these sorts of issues. And so coming together, and to be fair to them, they actually do a very good job, I think, of doing that already, but perhaps more robust collaboration mechanisms need to be put in place.
To be honest, one of the things I thought when I read through the report was I agreed with a lot of the ideas, but I did think, gosh, this is going to take some resourcing.
Yes.
It's... officials are already very busy and they're doing the best they can and they're doing, I think, a fantastic job. But incorporating some of these ideas will take a lot of thought in terms of the resources that we put into this work, not just within MFAT, but within the different agencies who also, feed into the process.
Yeah. So when I listen to that clip, they talk a lot, globalization, sovereignty issues, and we've already kind of covered off the sovereignty issues, but I kind of locate a lot of it. I think a lot of that was around, there was a lot of discussion at that point, and there still is, around inequality and, the unequal distribution of benefits, the benefits of trade. Does this report go anywhere in terms of making recommendations in that space? Is that the space? Is trade policy the right vehicle to address those sorts of concerns?
Well, I think a lot of those. I think a lot of the things that have led to a growing inequality gap have been driven by domestic policy that isn't necessarily related to trade policy. So it does really matter what your education system is like and how that delivers for all sections of society. How the state of your health system. Those sorts of issues make a really big difference. In saying that, though, I think looking at the way that trade agreements can more robustly deliver better results on environment, for example, or improving labour standards internationally, those are things that will have an impact on inequality and the quality of life of people in those two trading partners.
And I got the sense that the advisory board didn't want to get too deeply into the domestic policy side of things. They certainly recognise a number of the factors that have led to growing inequality. But I got the sense that while they recognise the complexities and the relationship between trade policy and those issues, that they also recognise that trade policy alone can't do everything. But they also talk about this idea of having a trade policy that respects a triple bottom line criteria that addresses social, environmental and economic outcomes. So I think it's recognising that you can't separate out these issues, but at the same time, it really has to be a whole of government and sort of much broader approach to address the underlying issues around inequality.
Yeah. So the government's going to pick up the recommendations and I think report back early next year. What do you think the 3 key findings, or the findings that you thought that resonated with you were?
Well, I think one of the ones that really resonated with me was the recommendation that the government should direct MFAT and Ministry for the Environment to lead work on a whole of government framework for trade and the environment, and to involve other departments in that, and that framework needs to take into account the urgency of climate change. And I guess that really resonated with me because, climate change is such a critical issue, and it's really crucial that trade policy is an enabler of action to address climate change. And so I think having that kind of approach where you get the various agencies involved is a really positive move. New Zealand's already taking some really positive steps in this space, launching negotiation of an agreement on trade and sustainability and climate change, along with a number of other partners, including Fiji and Costa Rica, Norway and Iceland. So that's a fantastic first step. And I think just building on that is something really positive to come out of this.
Yeah. Did you have anything to add there, Esther?
Yeah, well, I guess like Tracy, I really liked the emphasis in the Trade for All report on sort of proactive public policy thinking and making. I think that's particularly important, especially for New Zealand, where we have still a lot of growth to do in terms of the diversification of our economy. So I quite liked that. But for me, other parts of it that I really liked included the concept that a better New Zealand brand internationally had to be built. And that kind of fed into, for me, or was consistent with the work that we're doing as a sector with our Taste Pure Nature launch earlier this year. But that idea that as a New Zealand company or a sector, you really need to have a good New Zealand brand that is backed by cultural values, environmental integrity, strong quality values, etc., and that those things are backed up by research and by verification, and you do what you say.
Sure.
So I like that part of it.
Yeah.
There's just a couple of other recommendations that I thought were worth pointing out. One was the idea of establishing a parliamentary committee for treaties to consider all treaties and their domestic impact. I just think that that's probably something that has been overdue for us to look at. And I think, Esther, you already mentioned the digital space. I think there's recognition in there of obviously the opportunity, and there's huge opportunity for New Zealand companies in the digital space, but also the recommendation that recommends, a thorough review of our interests and bringing together people like the Privacy Commissioner, the Chief Digital Officer, to actually look at the whole picture of both the risks and opportunities.
Yeah, I think there's plenty here we could discuss, but we're going to need to move on. We do have, I do have David Pine, who's the chair of that advisory board. He will come and talk to us next year, early next year, after the government's considered his recommendations. So I think that's an opportunity for us to have like a fuller discussion, and perhaps one or both of you could be part of that as well. And yeah, I think that'd be quite cool. So why don't we move on to the next segment? I'm going to play a quick clip.
We need to fix this before it's broken. I don't think that if we allow a binding dispute settlement system to die, that it will be very easy for it to come back again. I think it was a really unique confluence of events in the 1990s that allowed the United States to sign on to this binding dispute settlement system.
So that was a clip from a panel discussion we had in May 2019 together with Chapman Tripp. Speaking was Professor Jennifer Hillman, a former US trade official and actually member of the WTO appellate body. What she was discussing there was her worry that if we don't find a solution, so this is back in May 2019, 2019, if we don't find a solution to the impasse on the selection of new WTO appellate body members, then the whole multilateral trading system will collapse. So today we've reached that point, or we're close to reaching that point. So 6th of December, next week, 10th of December is the deadline. And at that point, the appellate body will no longer be able to hear new cases. So, I mean, is the situation as dire as Jennifer Hillman outlined back in May? Is the multilateral trading system about to collapse? And will we notice any difference come December 11th? So that's the first question for you, Esther. Is that outline, the outline I've just given, broadly accurate? And where are we today?
I don't think it's quite as dramatic.
Oh, come on. We're going to make this exciting.
Sorry, I agree with Esther. Serious, but not that dramatic.
Yeah, I don't think I don't think it's quite so dramatic, but it is certainly very serious.
Yep.
And there is a lot at stake. The multilateral system has been a really valued part of, and I guess we've sort of taken for granted its existence, but it's really, it's responsible for New Zealand's success, really, as a exporting nation. Just for example, my sector in the 1970s, we exported to just 34 countries. We had, a huge amount of reliance on the UK, and we now export to over 120 different countries. A lot of that is down to the fact that we had the WTO, which set harmonised rules and rules that we could then enforce through the dispute settlement mechanism. But it also is owed to the network of FTAs as well. So, the WTO remains an absolute priority for the sector and for New Zealand business more broadly as well. So it is a serious situation, but maybe not as dramatic as you.
And that came through in the Trade for All report as well, that it needs to remain, the top priority for New Zealand is working with the multilateral system to shore it up and strengthen it.
Yeah. And have there been credible alternative proposals being put forward yet?
Well, I guess it's probably just helpful for listeners who are not so familiar with it to sort of identify what the issues actually are. And I think there's really two sort of separate sets of issues, if you like. There's the issue with the appellate body. And the way the dispute settlement system works is that if a country has a complaint that another country is not meeting its obligations, it can request consultations and have the dispute heard by an ad hoc dispute panel. That panel issues a report, and if the losing party wishes to, they can appeal to the appellate body. And currently we're in a situation, the appellate body is supposed to have 7 members, and then 3 members hear each appeal. And currently we're in a situation where, because of a failure to reach consensus on reappointment of members and appointment of new members, we're down to 3 members, and as of next week that's going to fall to 2. So in other words, we won't have a functioning appellate body. So that's sort of one set of issues, is the dispute settlement system, which we'll talk more about. The other issue is WTO reform more generally, and I don't know, Esther, if you wanted to say something about that.
I guess there's kind of 3 key concerns about the WTO more broadly. There's the first set of concerns are around the appellate body, which has led to this impasse that Tracy mentioned. I guess the kind of crux of that concern is around alleged overreach by the appellate body in some of its decisions. But the other 2 concerns also include the rules around the ability of WTO members to self-identify as developing countries in order to receive special treatment. And then the other one is failure of WTO members, many WTO members, to notify under the WTO when they're implementing certain measures. I should say that these concerns are actually held by a number of members, and they've also been long-held members. The WTO was established in 1995, and it's only natural that you go through a period of evolution and you grow, as a membership, but also the global economy has changed a lot as well. And so, these issues are shared by a large number of the WTO membership as well.
Yeah. So if you don't have a effectively functioning dispute settlement system, and that's a core part of the WTO, what do you have left?
Well, I think from a business perspective, I don't think that we should lose sight of the importance of the set of rules that the WTO lays down more broadly. I mean, for companies operating in the red meat sector, those are hugely important. They cover things that maybe to the average person are slightly boring, but matter hugely to companies who want to get their product into different markets. Those issues can cover things like labelling or, biosecurity requirements or indeed tariffs. So, the WTO has been very effective in kind of harmonising those rules, and it's made it possible to export to 120 different countries, not without challenges, but certainly with a lot more ease than previously. So I think, we need to give the WTO credit for that and remember that as a key part of its value proposition.
Yeah.
You are right in that if you can't enforce those rules, that does become challenging. And I think, one of the real benefits that the WTO has brought to the global trading world and indeed the business community is that sense of confidence, the confidence to be able to trade in a very complex world, but with a more harmonised set of rules, and to know that if things do go wrong, that you can enforce that. So, so I guess, we certainly encourage some kind of solution to the appellate body, but, all is not lost. The WTO still has established an incredibly valuable set of rules that we all operate on.
Yeah. I guess it's that confidence that comes from, predictability and certainty of a rule set, right? That for traders, exporters is just absolutely critical.
Yeah, it it really levels the playing field, and for a small country like New Zealand in particular, it means that we can go out into the world with a certain amount of predictability and expectation. But arguably it's just as important for those bigger economies too.
Yeah. And so
I guess I was just going to sort of add, to Esther's point that as a small country, the dispute settlement system, I think, has been particularly valuable because, if we have an issue where another larger country is not complying with the rules, what we have now is a legal system where we can sort of put that dispute off to one side, if you like. The lawyers deal with it. You have established procedures and even a system for, retaliation if the losing country decides not to come into compliance, because that's what happens at the end of these disputes. There's no damages. The losing country is supposed to come into compliance with the rules. If you don't have that kind of system where you have the certainty of a binding, report, then you sort of fall back to a system that's much more power-oriented rather than, legally oriented. And as a small country, without the power, that becomes much more problematic for us.
Yeah.
I think too, sorry, just to build on that, but I mean, the other real benefit of a system that isn't constructed on power is that you really depoliticise the process. So you can continue to have a very constructive, warm, close and, relationship with a trading partner, but still have a market access issue that you're dealing with at the WTO, and those two things, certainly in New Zealand's experience, don't cross over. We leave those two things separately, and that's been incredibly effective.
Yeah. So how often has New Zealand, had to rely on, the dispute settlement system and the appellate body? Do we have a history of taking a lot of cases to, through this process? And,
it's been very successful for New Zealand. We've brought 9 complaints, which I guess in the overall scheme of things, it's not a huge number. You could compare, I guess, with some of our trading partners. Canada's brought 40, Japan's brought 26. But, it's a decent number, and we've been successful in all of them. And I think we've taken it very seriously. We've only brought a complaint when, it's something that we've exhausted other options. We've tried, officials have talked, we've tried to reach diplomatic solutions, and it's the last resort. And it has worked well for us on those occasions. And we've been able to bring complaints against the likes of Canada, the EU, the US, much larger nations. And as Esther said, continue to maintain our relationships with those countries while bringing those disputes through this legal system.
Yeah. Do you have an example of a case that maybe our listeners will have heard of before, or, the one that's popping to my mind is the Australian apples stuff, or even the Indonesian beef cases.
Yeah. So that was going to be my example because it's recent, but it's also a really nice example of cooperation between New Zealand and the United States on a common trade issue that we were successful in. So just, for listeners, the background to that case was that in sort of 2000 and 2010, New Zealand's red meat industry exported quite a lot there. I think they were our second largest beef market by volume. But following a series of import restrictions, our trade dropped by about 80%. And it's through a whole range of diplomatic efforts and consultations, those were unsuccessful, and so we decided to take a case, and the US joined us as co-complainants.
Yeah. What form did those restrictions take?
Complex ones, but essentially sort of import licensing requirements. Requirements for companies who wanted to get their product over the border.
So they make it very hard to get.
Very difficult to get. Also unpredictable as well. So sometimes you could get them, sometimes you couldn't. I guess the theme really of trade is that you need predictable, stable trade in order to continue to build those relationships, but also know what your customers want so that you can deliver to that. And that's why our trade really fell away. But as a result of that case, the WTO appellate body found in favour of the United States and New Zealand, and so Indonesia has been through a process of removing those trade restrictions. It has meant that some of New Zealand trade has recovered a little bit, although we're still about 70% down on what we were trading in at in 2010. And so that, I guess, shows you how powerful some of these protectionist measures can be, and the long-term damage as well. We're almost 20 years after the fact. So,
and is that an issue with?
10 years, not
10
20.
years. So is that an issue with just reestablishing your supply chains or your customer base back in the market? So you've lost that access for 10 years, and then
exactly. I mean, if you vacate a market, other countries who may find it easier to overcome those restrictions fill it, and And as you move away, then you lose those customer relationships. And it's very difficult to then re-establish market access. I think, we found something quite similar after the Apple's case.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things, and there are other people who are far greater experts on this than I am, but after the Apple's case, where, essentially the conditions that Australia had imposed on importation of apples kept our apples out of the market, we, were successful in our case at the WTO. But I think during that time, New Zealand growers had found really good markets elsewhere, in part as a result of our free trade negotiations, for example, with Chinese Taipei. So sometimes I guess you find better markets elsewhere and move your products there. But having said that, it's, the importance of bringing the case is to ensure that you actually have the opportunity of going into whichever market presents the opportunity at the time and not closing off those opportunities. So it is about opportunities as well as whether or not you're actually supplying at any given point in time.
Yeah. Have there been issues so you can win a case, right? And then how do you enforce your win, in a market like Indonesia or elsewhere?
Well, I guess the first step is that the dispute settlement body, which is the body at the WTO that oversees disputes, will adopt either the panel report or the appellate, or as modified by the appellate body. And then the country who has been found to have measures that don't comply is asked to bring their measures into compliance. And you'll negotiate a time period to allow them to make the changes they need to make. If they don't come into compliance, there's a system that allows for retaliation. So, for example, in the Indonesia case, legally, if Indonesia does not come into compliance within the agreed time frame, we could take retaliatory measures. So that means we could impose tariffs on Indonesian products. But retaliation is not really a desirable thing to have to do. Again, it's really a last resort because often you're going to harm your own consumers in the process of, putting tariffs on goods that might be, integral to supply chains in your own country, or just, goods that consumers want to purchase. And also for a small country like New Zealand, it's actually, if you're in a dispute with a larger country, it's pretty hard to actually do something that will seriously harm them, because the idea of the retaliation is to be able to convince the other country to come into compliance. Mm-hmm. So, countries get quite strategic with their retaliation. They'll put tariffs on a particularly politically, sensitive or strong sector, and the hope that that sector will then go to their government and say, come on, get your measures into compliance because we're hurting now.
Yeah.
I think, though, compliance has a really good track record in the WTO. It
does.
And I think that's because the dispute settlement mechanism has actually been a real success, notwithstanding some of the challenges there, but it has been a real success story as part of the WTO. And so, if you're a country who's lost an agreement, lost a case, that might be disappointing, but you have strong interests in complying with it, because next time you want to take a case for your own interests, you want your trading partner to comply as well. So, actually compliance has not been an issue.
And I mean, in some cases as well, the country who's on the receiving end of the complaint is actually happy enough for the complaint to be brought against them, because it then gives them an independent, report to point to and say to their domestic constituencies, look, we need to change this measure because we've lost this case at the WTO. This international, tribunal has ruled against us. So that can actually give a government some leverage when it comes to dealing with their own constituencies who might want to keep that protectionist measure in place.
So I just want to round out this discussion by going back to, I know, my very dramatic intro to the segment, but that deadline is the 10th or 11th of December. And it really does look like there's not going to be a solution there. And Jennifer Hillman, talks about, if there isn't a solution reached before then, it's going to be very difficult to revive that body because of the historical factors that led into the formation. those are not going to be repeated. What are your, what is going to happen on the 11th of December? I mean, are we going to see a flood of, I don't know. What are we going to see?
Well, I feel like I'm uncharacteristically positive for a trade negotiator or a former trade negotiator, because I like to think that actually the majority of the WTO membership see it as a very valuable part of the multilateral trading system, and that we have all benefited from the WTO. And so, I would like to think that even if we don't reach a point next week where, the appellate body can continue, that members will work towards a solution. Might take some time, but there's certainly enough backing from the business community and globally. I mean, not just in New Zealand. But also, there are a lot of champions within the WTO membership as well that are working very hard, at New Zealand being one of them, to try and effect some of this reform. So I'd like to be more positive than that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, like Esther, I'm also positive. And, I think it's also just worth, thinking about how the system operates. I mean, the big change that happened in 1994 when the WTO was established was that prior to that, if you had a dispute settlement or a dispute panel, in order for their report to be adopted, every country had to vote for that. So in other words, the losing party could veto adoption of the report. With the WTO, the system that was flipped on its head, and it was automatically adopted unless there was a veto, and of course the winning party was never going to veto it. So there was that aspect, and then the appellate body being added to the system, I think, were the two key changes. And that's incredibly important, for predictability, for certainty, and for countries like New Zealand to know that the panel report will be adopted. But I also think it's worth remembering that even before 1994, there was a dispute settlement system that in a lot of, I think it was about 70% of cases, panel reports actually were adopted. So it's not, for New Zealand, it's not a situation we want to go back to, but it's also, again, I guess, not quite as dramatic as saying there is no dispute settlement system after the 10th of December. However, there is certainly a lot of uncertainty and a lot that needs to be worked through, and yeah, I just sort of echo Esther's thoughts.
So I think that's a good place to leave this discussion. Good to hear there's still some optimism around, and we'll certainly we'll follow that closely next week and then on from there. But let's move into the next segment. So over the last two episodes, I've mentioned that we have a new content series coming up that's focused on the NZ-US trade relationship. And what I wanted to do today was just share a little clip from an interview I've done with Christy Grant from Miramar Creative. And so she's focused on the creative sector and creative exports. So let me share that clip and we'll have a little chat.
So what we do really well is we share ideas. We work together. We had our Creative Futures conference a couple of weeks ago, and we had a range of, as you know, some fantastic speakers came from the US and from the UK, and they commented about how New Zealanders will share and engage with each other quite easily. They're quick to analyse something and decide whether it's a good idea, and then actually give it a go. So there is the old adage of the number 8 wire mentality that we have, and the number 8 wire mentality is the foundation of who we are, but it's more than that now. It's grown into the next step of what that looks like, and I think New Zealanders are savvy. I think that we're able to identify opportunities quite quickly and work towards them. So that's something I think we do really well in the creative sector. So it's the people that really make it. It's the experience. It's the ability to work together and create something that on your own obviously wouldn't be as strong without the input of so many other people.
So like I said, that was Christy Grant from Miramar Creative. The creative sector, I think, is quite an interesting and exciting part of the relationship, currently employs 131,000 people, contributes $17.5 billion to GDP. So that's the creative sector in the broadest sense. Christy's really focusing in on the film sector, but a really interesting discussion around what makes our creative sector unique. What are some of the barriers they are experiencing in terms of export growth, and where she sees the potential, which is around the importance of collaboration and connection, particularly with US players. So interesting discussion that will come out early next year, and that's part of a bigger series that, like I said, is looking at the relationship from a modern perspective. I think we have a thesis that our perspective on that relationship is about 10 years out of date, and so we want to update that and look at parts of that relationship, creative sector, technology, the value add and services part of the relationship. Any kind of immediate thoughts on that?
I guess just to say that I probably agree with that. Like, our trade relationship with the United States has traditionally been dominated by goods. So, red meat. Traditionally the United States has been our largest beef market, but also an important lamb market as well. Like you say, that is probably a perspective of the relationship that's a little bit out of date, because increasingly, the US-New Zealand relationship is dominated by really innovative services sector or creative sector, investment, all of those kinds of things. So it is probably a good time to sort of begin to think about, well, actually, what does it look like today, and how has it changed?
Yeah, and I mean, I always find it just really inspiring when I go along to an event that's organised by Export New Zealand, and they're highlighting companies that are succeeding in the US, and things that you might just not have thought would be possible. And I think a presentation I heard from the CEO of Mojo was a great example that he's opening up coffee shop after coffee shop in Chicago, and how fantastic is that to have Wellington's sort of own coffee brand being sold in downtown Chicago. So it just shows all the possibilities that there are that, like you say, probably just traditionally we didn't really think were possible. Yeah,
the other interview I've done recently is with a guy called Sean Edlin from Dotterel Technologies, which is a drone acoustic device company, and their big focus is on the US, the use of drones in the film sector. So a silent, flying drone being able to film first responder situations, defense applications. Again, it's just really exciting to talk. That's a young firm, it's a startup. Quite exciting to just talk to them and hear what they're thinking about the prospects and their pathway. So anyway, those will come out early next year as part of a bigger program around the new trade narrative. So follow closely, and we'll update you, I guess, in coming episodes of this show. So that's a good place to wind things up. Thank you, Tracy and Esther, for really taking me through, in a simple way, an accessible way, the complex world of trade. And I think making this whole world of trade a little bit more accessible, I think that's important to that inclusivity goal. Thank you again. Thanks also to Michael Jeffrey, our NZUS Council intern, helps with the production and promotion of this podcast each week. If you do enjoy the podcast, let us know by leaving a review, providing a comment, or getting in contact. You'll find our details in the episode notes. So that's another episode down. A couple of things to think about going into the weekend. I'm Jordan Small. Join us again next week for the Friday download.